Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through history's most uncomfortable truths. Tonight we're exploring the lives of medieval peasant women, who faced all the hardships of peasant life while also dealing with gender-specific forms of exploitation that made their already miserable existence even worse. Before we dive into this tale of double oppression, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy falling asleep to stories of historical suffering, and subscribe only if you genuinely want more content about why being female in the Middle Ages meant experiencing every possible form of medieval hardship plus several additional ones specifically designed for women. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining me for these midnight explorations of why the past was particularly terrible for half the population. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack that wasn't prepared by someone who worked 16-hour days while pregnant and had no legal rights, and let's explore why being a medieval peasant woman was like playing life on the hardest difficulty setting while everyone else got to use cheat codes. Chapter 1: Childhood's End, From Girl to Commodity. Medieval peasant girls experienced the briefest possible childhoods before being transformed into economic assets whose value was measured entirely by their potential for labor and reproduction. This wasn't gradual maturation, it was systematic preparation for lives of servitude that began almost from birth. Gender roles were enforced from infancy, with girl children assigned domestic tasks as soon as they could walk, while their brothers received preferential treatment in food allocation, education opportunities, and social expectations. Girls learned early that their needs were secondary to everyone else's survival. Work assignments for peasant girls included caring for younger siblings, tending animals, spinning thread, preparing food, and performing household tasks that were considered too menial for adult women but essential for family survival. Child labor wasn't just expected, it was the foundation of medieval household economics. Educational deprivation was total for peasant girls, who were denied even the minimal literacy that some peasant boys might receive from village priests. Girls were considered incapable of learning and undeserving of intellectual development, ensuring that they remained intellectually dependent on male relatives throughout their lives. Marriage preparation involved teaching girls to accept male authority without question while learning domestic skills that would make them valuable wives for arranged marriages. This preparation was essentially training for subordination disguised as practical education. Physical development was often stunted by malnutrition and overwork, with peasant girls receiving less food than their brothers while performing heavy labor that interfered with normal growth and development. Many peasant women remained physically small and weak due to childhood deprivation. Sexual vulnerability began early for peasant girls who had no legal protection from adult men and were often subjected to sexual abuse by family members, employers, or community members who faced no consequences for exploiting vulnerable children. Economic value was calculated based on girls' potential as workers and mothers, with families evaluating daughters as investments that might pay off through advantageous marriages or productive labor. Girls were commodities rather than individuals with inherent worth. Social conditioning taught peasant girls to view their own suffering as natural and inevitable while accepting male authority as divinely ordained. This psychological conditioning made resistance to oppression seem impossible or sinful. Coming of age occurred abruptly and without ceremony when girls reached physical maturity and were immediately considered available for marriage and childbearing. There was no adolescent period, girls became women as soon as they were physically capable of reproduction. Family relationships were shaped by economic necessity rather than emotional bonds, with peasant girls learning that love was a luxury that poor families couldn't afford. Survival took priority over nurturing relationships. Future prospects for peasant girls were limited to marriage, religious life, or remaining unmarried dependents in their families' households. There were no alternative career paths or opportunities for independence available to women in medieval peasant society. Chapter 2: Marriage, Legal Slavery with Religious Blessing. Medieval marriage for peasant women was essentially legalized ownership transfer where women became property of their husbands with no rights, no legal recourse, and no escape from whatever treatment their new owners chose to provide. This wasn't a romantic union, it was a business transaction with lifetime consequences. Arranged marriages were negotiated between families based on economic considerations, with women having no input into decisions that would determine the rest of their lives. Marriage contracts were property agreements where women were the property being transferred rather than parties to the negotiation. Age disparities were common, with young girls often married to much older men who could afford the bride price or provide economic advantages to the girl's family. These marriages were essentially legalized child abuse that society sanctioned through religious ceremony. Bride prices or dowries required families to pay for the privilege of marrying off their daughters, creating economic burdens that could bankrupt peasant households. Families had to choose between providing adequate dowries and meeting their own survival needs. Wedding ceremonies emphasized the woman's transition from her father's property to her husband's property, with religious rituals that explicitly required women to promise obedience to husbands who made no reciprocal promises of care or protection. Legal status after marriage made women invisible in law, with wives unable to own property, make contracts, or bring legal complaints independently. Married women existed legally only through their husbands, who could control every aspect of their wives' lives. Domestic authority belonged entirely to husbands, who could beat, confine, or control their wives' behavior without legal consequences. Medieval law explicitly granted husbands the right to use physical violence to discipline wives who were considered naturally disobedient. Sexual obligations were considered absolute for wives, who had no right to refuse sexual demands from husbands regardless of their own health, desires, or circumstances. Marital rape wasn't recognized as a concept because wives were considered sexually available to their husbands at all times. Economic control meant that wives had no independent access to money or resources, with husbands controlling all family finances while wives might not even know how much money the family had or how it was spent. Social isolation was common as married women were expected to remain in their homes and avoid social contact that might interfere with domestic duties or create opportunities for adultery. Marriage often meant losing contact with friends and family members. Divorce was essentially impossible for peasant women, who had no legal grounds for ending marriages regardless of abuse, abandonment, or other circumstances that made marriage unbearable. Women were trapped in marriages that could only end through death. Widowhood could provide some relief from male control, but widows faced economic insecurity and social vulnerability that often forced them to remarry quickly or live in poverty. Even widowhood offered limited freedom because women remained economically dependent on male relatives. Chapter 3: Childbirth, the Medieval Death Sentence. Pregnancy and childbirth for medieval peasant women were essentially death sentences served with a side of excruciating pain, delivered without anesthesia or adequate medical care by people who understood nothing about human reproduction except that it frequently killed the women involved. Maternal mortality rates were staggering, with women facing roughly a 10% chance of dying with each pregnancy and most women facing multiple pregnancies during their reproductive years. Childbirth was literally Russian roulette where the bullets were infection, hemorrhage, and complications that medieval medicine couldn't treat. Prenatal care was non-existent, with pregnant women continuing heavy physical labor until they went into labor, often in fields or while performing household tasks that would be considered dangerous for pregnant women today. Pregnancy was treated as a minor inconvenience rather than a medical condition requiring care. Birth assistance came from village women with no medical training who relied on superstition, folk remedies, and prayer rather than scientific knowledge. These birth attendants often caused more harm than help through interventions based on tradition rather than effectiveness. Pain management during labor consisted of herbal remedies that were often ineffective or dangerous, with women expected to endure hours or days of agony without complaint. Medieval theology taught that labor pain was divine punishment for Eve's sin, making pain relief seem impious. Complications during birth were usually fatal because medieval medicine couldn't address problems like breached presentations, cord complications, or severe bleeding. Women who experienced difficult births often died slowly and painfully over days or weeks. Postpartum care was minimal, with new mothers expected to resume normal activities within days of giving birth regardless of their physical condition. There was no recovery period or special care for women who had just survived one of the most dangerous experiences of their lives. Infection rates were high due to unsanitary conditions and lack of understanding about disease transmission, with many women dying from childbed fever and other infections that were easily preventable with proper hygiene. Multiple pregnancies were expected and often resulted in women being constantly pregnant or nursing throughout their reproductive years, creating cycles of physical exhaustion and health deterioration that aged women prematurely and often killed them young. Miscarriages and stillbirths were common but were often blamed on women's moral failings or insufficient faith rather than understood as medical events. Women who lost pregnancies faced both grief and social stigma. Infant mortality was so high that many women lost multiple children, creating psychological trauma on top of physical suffering while families planned for the likelihood that not all children would survive to adulthood. Family planning was impossible because women had no control over their reproductive lives and no access to effective contraception. Women were expected to accept whatever number of pregnancies resulted from their husband's sexual demands. Chapter 4: Domestic Labor, the Endless Workday. The daily life of medieval peasant women consisted of back-breaking labor that began before dawn and continued until after dark, with no days off, no vacations, and no recognition that their work contributed anything valuable to family survival. This wasn't housework, it was industrial production disguised as domestic duty. Food production required women to grow, process, and prepare all food consumed by their families using primitive tools and techniques that made every meal a major undertaking. Bread making alone could take entire days from grain grinding to final baking. Textile production was women's responsibility from sheep shearing through cloth weaving, requiring skills in processing raw wool, spinning thread, dyeing fabric, and creating all clothing and household textiles. A single garment might represent weeks of a woman's labor. Water collection involved carrying heavy containers over long distances because medieval villages rarely had convenient water sources. Women might walk miles daily to collect water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and washing. Fuel gathering required women to collect wood, peat, or other combustible materials for heating and cooking, often traveling to distant forests or bogs to gather materials that were essential for family survival. Animal care was women's work, including feeding, milking, and managing livestock that provided food and income for peasant families. This work was physically demanding and had to be performed regardless of weather or women's health. Child care was exclusively women's responsibility, with mothers expected to supervise, feed, and care for multiple children while also performing all other household tasks. There was no concept of shared parenting or male involvement in child rearing. Cleaning and maintenance of medieval homes required constant attention because poor construction and primitive conditions meant that homes quickly became dirty, drafty, and pest-infested without constant maintenance efforts. Garden management fell to women, who were responsible for growing vegetables, herbs, and other plants that supplemented the family's diet and provided materials for medicine and household use. Food preservation required women to salt, smoke, dry, or otherwise preserve food for winter consumption using techniques that were labor-intensive and often resulted in food that was barely edible but better than starvation. Seasonal work included additional tasks like harvest assistance, wool processing, and preparation for winter that were added to women's regular domestic duties rather than replacing them. Healthcare provision made women responsible for treating family illnesses and injuries using folk remedies and nursing care that had little medical effectiveness but was the only healthcare available to peasant families. Financial management of household resources was women's responsibility, requiring them to stretch inadequate resources to meet family needs while having no control over how money was earned or major financial decisions were made. Chapter 5: Economic Exploitation, Working for Nothing. Medieval peasant women performed essential economic functions that sustained both their families and the broader feudal economy while receiving no compensation, no recognition, and no legal protection for their contributions. This wasn't just unpaid work, it was systematic theft of women's labor disguised as natural domestic duty. Agricultural labor was performed by women alongside men during planting, tending, and harvesting seasons, but women received no portion of crop proceeds and had no say in agricultural decisions despite providing essential labor for family survival. Market participation involved women selling surplus household products like eggs, cheese, vegetables, or textiles, but the proceeds belonged to their husbands who controlled all family finances while women had no independent economic identity. Craft production by women included spinning, weaving, brewing, and other skilled work that generated income for families, but women's expertise was undervalued and their products sold at lower prices than similar work performed by male craftsmen. Seasonal employment opportunities for women included grain harvesting, hop picking, and other temporary work that provided essential income for peasant families during economically difficult periods, but women earned lower wages than men for similar work. Debt labor occurred when peasant families couldn't meet their obligations to feudal lords, with women often required to work additional unpaid days to satisfy family debts while having no voice in the financial decisions that created those debts. Service obligations to feudal lords included women's labor for castle maintenance, food preparation, and textile production that was required as part of feudal obligations but provided no direct benefit to the women performing the work. Tax responsibilities fell partially on women who had to contribute to family tax obligations through their labor and production, but women had no representation in decisions about tax policies that affected their lives. Trade restrictions prevented women from engaging in many forms of commerce independently, limiting their economic opportunities while ensuring that their labor enriched male family members rather than providing personal economic security. Property rights were non-existent for married women who couldn't own land, tools, or other productive assets independently, making them economically dependent on male relatives throughout their lives. Inheritance laws typically excluded women from inheriting family property, ensuring that women's lifetime contributions to family economic success provided no security for their old age or widowhood. Labor organization excluded women from craft guilds and other professional associations that might have protected their economic interests or provided training opportunities for skill development. Economic planning for families was done by men who made decisions about resource allocation, investment priorities, and financial strategies, while women who performed much of the actual productive work had no input into economic decisions that affected their daily lives. Chapter 6: Legal Powerlessness, Justice Denied. Medieval legal systems treated women as perpetual minors who were incapable of independent legal action and unworthy of legal protection from abuse, exploitation, or violence. This wasn't just discrimination, it was systematic exclusion from any form of justice or legal recourse. Court access was denied to women who couldn't bring legal cases independently, testify against men, or serve on juries that decided legal disputes. The legal system was designed by men, for men, and excluded women from any meaningful participation. Property disputes involving women had to be handled by male relatives because women couldn't represent themselves in legal proceedings, even when the disputes involved property that women had created through their own labor. Marriage law gave husbands complete legal control over their wives, with no legal remedies available to women who were abused, abandoned, or mistreated by their spouses. Marriage contracts were agreements between men that treated women as transferable property. Criminal law provided minimal protection for crimes against women while imposing harsh penalties on women who violated social norms or challenged male authority. Women were simultaneously underprotected as victims and overpunished as defendants. Testimony rights were limited for women, who couldn't testify against men in many legal contexts and whose testimony was considered less credible than men's testimony even when women had direct knowledge of disputed facts. Contract law excluded women from making independent agreements about work, trade, or financial matters, requiring male consent for any legal arrangements that might affect women's lives or economic circumstances. Inheritance disputes were decided according to laws that systematically favored male heirs while excluding women from family property, regardless of women's contributions to family economic success. Divorce law made it virtually impossible for women to end marriages, while men could more easily dissolve marriages or abandon wives without legal consequences. The legal system trapped women in marriages while providing men with escape options. Custody rights for children belonged entirely to fathers, with mothers having no legal claim to their own children if marriages ended or husbands died. Women could be separated from their children without legal recourse. Violence against women was legally tolerated within marriage and often unpunished outside marriage, with legal systems treating violence against women as less serious than violence against men or property crimes. Appeal processes were unavailable to women who disagreed with legal decisions because women couldn't initiate legal proceedings independently or challenge court decisions through formal appeal mechanisms. Legal representation was impossible for women who couldn't hire lawyers or advocates independently, leaving them dependent on male relatives who might not share their interests or priorities in legal disputes. Conclusion: why medieval life was hell squared for women. As we conclude our exploration of medieval peasant women's lives, it becomes clear that being female in the Middle Ages meant experiencing every hardship of medieval life while also facing additional forms of oppression specifically designed to exploit and control women. The intersection of class and gender oppression created conditions for medieval peasant women that were worse than slavery, because at least slaves had some economic value that provided incentives for minimal care and protection. Peasant women were expected to provide unlimited labor and reproductive services while receiving nothing in return except survival rations and religious rhetoric about feminine virtue. Economic systems extracted enormous value from women's labor while denying women any share in the wealth they created through their work. Medieval economies depended on unpaid female labor but structured legal and social systems to ensure that women could never accumulate resources or achieve independence. Legal frameworks systematically excluded women from any form of protection or recourse while making them vulnerable to unlimited exploitation by male family members and community authorities. Medieval law was designed to facilitate rather than prevent the systematic abuse of women. Social structures reinforced women's subordination through religious ideology, cultural traditions, and community pressure that made resistance to oppression seem impossible or immoral. Women were taught to accept their own exploitation as divinely ordained and naturally appropriate. Medical systems provided no care for specifically female health needs while treating reproductive functions as diseases rather than normal biological processes. Medieval medicine was particularly dangerous for women, who faced additional health risks from constant pregnancy and childbirth. Cultural narrative celebrated female suffering while providing no recognition for women's contributions to family and community survival. Medieval culture treated women's pain as entertainment while denying the value of their essential labor. The ultimate lesson of medieval peasant women's lives is that systematic oppression can be so complete and pervasive that victims are denied even the language or concepts necessary to understand their situation as unjust. Medieval women lived in a world designed to exploit them while teaching them that their exploitation was natural and proper. Sleep well tonight, knowing that tomorrow you won't be considered property, you won't be forced into marriage as a child, you won't die in childbirth without medical care, and you won't work 16-hour days for no compensation while being told that your suffering is divinely ordained. Chapter 7: Violence and Abuse, Normalized Terror. Medieval peasant women lived in constant fear of violence from family members, community members, and authorities who could abuse them with complete impunity. This wasn't occasional domestic conflict, it was systematic terrorism that kept women in permanent states of fear and submission. Domestic violence was legally sanctioned and socially encouraged as a husband's right and duty to discipline his wife through physical punishment. Church doctrine explicitly supported wife beating as necessary for maintaining proper family hierarchy, making violence a religious obligation rather than a criminal act. Sexual violence against peasant women was common and rarely punished, with rape considered a property crime against the woman's male relatives rather than a violent assault against the woman herself. Women who were sexually assaulted often faced blame and social ostracism rather than justice or support. Child abuse of girls was considered normal discipline and preparation for adult life, with fathers and other male relatives using violence to teach girls submission and obedience. Physical and sexual abuse of daughters was overlooked or explicitly permitted as paternal authority. Community violence against women included public humiliation, physical punishment, and mob justice for women who violated social norms or challenged male authority. Women could be beaten, stripped, or tortured in public for adultery, disobedience, or simply being unpopular. Religious violence was sanctioned against women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or moral violations, with church authorities leading persecution campaigns that tortured and killed women for imaginary crimes. Religious violence against women was justified as necessary for spiritual purification. Economic violence involved withholding food, shelter, or other necessities from women who were considered disobedient or unproductive. Starvation and exposure were used as punishment tools against women who had no independent means of survival. Psychological violence through constant threats, humiliation, and degradation was used to maintain women's subordination while breaking their spirits and self-respect. Women were subjected to verbal abuse designed to convince them they deserved whatever treatment they received. Institutional violence was practiced by courts, churches, and feudal authorities who used physical punishment, imprisonment, and execution against women who challenged established authority. Legal systems were designed to facilitate rather than prevent violence against women. Medical violence included painful and dangerous treatments performed on women without their consent, often for conditions related to sexuality or reproduction that were considered moral failings rather than medical problems. Intergenerational violence was passed from mothers to daughters as women who had been brutalized learned to accept violence as normal and inevitable, creating cycles of abuse that continued across generations. Social acceptance of violence against women made it impossible for victims to seek help or protection, with communities viewing abuse as private family matters that were none of their business or as justified punishment for female misbehavior. Chapter 8: Religion as Control Mechanism. Medieval Christianity was weaponized against peasant women through theological doctrines that justified their oppression while promising heavenly rewards for earthly submission. This wasn't spiritual guidance, it was ideological control that made women complicit in their own exploitation. Original sin doctrine blamed women for humanity's fall from grace, teaching that female suffering was divine punishment for Eve's disobedience and that women were inherently more sinful than men. This theological framework made women's oppression seem divinely ordained rather than socially constructed. Biblical interpretation emphasized passages that commanded female submission while ignoring teachings about love, justice, and human dignity. Selective scripture reading created religious justification for treating women as inferior beings who deserved subordination. Confession requirements forced women to report their private thoughts and actions to male priests who could use this information to control women's behavior while offering no confidentiality or protection from abuse. Confession was surveillance disguised as spiritual guidance. Religious education for women focused entirely on obedience, chastity, and acceptance of suffering rather than providing intellectual development or spiritual empowerment. Women were taught to be passive recipients of male religious authority rather than active participants in spiritual life. Sainthood models presented to women emphasized martyrdom, celibacy, and extreme self-sacrifice as feminine virtues, teaching women that their highest calling was to suffer and die for others rather than to live fulfilling lives for themselves. Church authority was exclusively male, with women forbidden from holding religious offices or interpreting scripture independently. This exclusion ensured that religious doctrine would always reflect male interests while silencing female perspectives on spiritual matters. Moral policing by religious authorities controlled women's behavior through constant surveillance and punishment for violations of sexual, social, or religious norms. Churches functioned as community control centers that monitored and disciplined women's lives. Witchcraft accusations were used to eliminate women who challenged religious or social authority, with church-sponsored persecution campaigns that tortured and killed women for imaginary crimes. Witch hunts were gender-based terrorism disguised as religious purification. Tithing obligations required women to contribute to church finances through their labor and production while having no voice in how religious institutions used their contributions. Churches extracted wealth from women while excluding them from decision-making processes. Spiritual manipulation convinced women that their suffering was spiritually beneficial and that resistance to oppression was sinful rebellion against divine will. Religion was used to make women grateful for their own exploitation. Afterlife promises offered women rewards in heaven for accepting earthly suffering, creating incentive systems that encouraged women to endure abuse rather than seek justice or improvement in their current lives. Chapter 9: Medical Horror Specific to Women. Medieval medicine was particularly dangerous for women, whose reproductive systems were viewed as diseased aberrations that required violent intervention rather than natural biological processes deserving appropriate care. This wasn't healthcare, it was systematic torture disguised as medical treatment. Gynecological knowledge was virtually non-existent, with medical understanding of female anatomy based on superstition and religious doctrine rather than scientific observation. Physicians believed that women's reproductive organs were inverted male organs that hadn't properly developed. Menstruation was considered a disease that made women temporarily insane and physically contaminated, requiring isolation and purification rituals rather than understanding as a normal biological function. Women were forbidden from handling food, attending religious services, or engaging in normal activities during menstruation. Pregnancy complications were treated through bloodletting, purging, and other interventions that weakened already vulnerable women while providing no medical benefit. Pregnant women who experienced problems were often killed by treatments intended to help them. Birth control was forbidden by church doctrine and largely unknown by medical practitioners, leaving women with no control over their reproductive lives while facing constant pregnancy and childbirth that frequently killed them. Fertility treatments involved painful and dangerous procedures designed to force pregnancy in women who were considered failures if they didn't produce children. Infertile women were subjected to medical torture while being blamed for their inability to conceive. Breast diseases and infections were treated with cutting, burning, and other violent interventions that often caused more harm than the original conditions. Women's breasts were viewed as sources of sin and disease rather than functional body parts. Mental health problems in women were attributed to wandering wombs and other imaginary conditions that were treated through physical restraint, violence, and sexual assault by medical practitioners who believed that brutal treatment could cure female psychological problems. Surgical procedures on women were performed without anesthesia and often without medical necessity, with physicians using women's bodies for experimental treatments that provided no benefit to patients but satisfied medical curiosity. Contraceptive knowledge that did exist was often dangerous and ineffective, with women using poisonous substances and dangerous procedures that could kill them while providing minimal pregnancy prevention. Abortion attempts were illegal and extremely dangerous, with women dying from infections, bleeding, and poisoning while trying to end unwanted pregnancies using crude and deadly methods. Medical authority over women's bodies was absolute, with physicians and male family members making medical decisions for women without considering their wishes or consent.
Women had no right to refuse medical treatment, even when that treatment was painful and ineffective. Chapter 10: Widowhood, Freedom or New Vulnerability. Widowhood represented the only potential escape from male control for medieval peasant women, but this freedom came at enormous costs and created new forms of vulnerability that often made widows' lives even more precarious than married women's lives. Legal status of widows was complex and contradictory, with some widows gaining limited rights to manage property while others remained under the control of male relatives who inherited authority over them from their deceased husbands. Economic vulnerability was extreme for widows who often had no independent means of support and faced immediate poverty when their husbands died. Many widows were forced to remarry quickly or face starvation, making their supposed freedom largely illusory. Property rights for widows varied but were often disputed by male relatives who claimed that women were incapable of managing land or businesses independently. Widows frequently lost family property through legal challenges they couldn't afford to defend. Social isolation affected widows who were viewed as sexually dangerous and economically burdensome by their communities, leading to exclusion from social activities and support networks that had sustained them during marriage. Remarriage pressure forced many widows to accept new husbands quickly, often marrying men who were inappropriate matches but provided economic security. Widows had little choice in remarriage partners and often faced worse treatment from second husbands. Employment opportunities for widows were limited to the lowest paid and most dangerous occupations, with widows working as servants, wet nurses, or in other positions that provided minimal compensation while exposing them to exploitation and abuse. Religious exploitation targeted widows through church requirements for donations and volunteer labor, with religious authorities claiming that widows had special obligations to support church activities while having fewer resources to contribute. Family conflicts arose when widows remained in households where their adult children or in-laws resented supporting them, leading to neglect, abuse, or abandonment of elderly widows who had no alternative living arrangements. Sexual vulnerability increased for widows who were viewed as sexually available but were outside the protection of marriage, making them targets for sexual assault and exploitation by men who faced no consequences for abusing unprotected women. Legal disputes over inheritance often consumed whatever resources widows might have inherited, with male relatives challenging women's property rights through expensive court proceedings that impoverished widows regardless of the outcomes. Healthcare access was particularly poor for widows who couldn't afford medical treatment and had no male relatives obligated to provide care during illness or disability, leading to neglect and premature death. End-of-life care for widows was often inadequate or non-existent, with elderly widows dying alone and uncared for because they had no economic value to anyone and no legal claims on their family's resources. Chapter 11: The Seasonal Cycles of Female Suffering. Medieval peasant women's lives were structured around seasonal cycles that brought different forms of hardship and exploitation throughout the year, creating annual rhythms of suffering that offered no respite from the demands of survival and reproduction. Spring labor demanded that women work in fields during planting season while also managing increased household responsibilities as families emerged from winter deprivation. Pregnant women worked through morning sickness and physical exhaustion during critical agricultural periods. Summer heat created additional health hazards for women working in fields while wearing heavy clothing and carrying out domestic tasks that required constant fire maintenance for cooking and textile production. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were common during harvest season. Autumn preservation work required women to process and preserve food for winter storage while also contributing to harvest labor, creating impossible schedules where women worked around the clock to prepare families for winter survival. Winter confinement trapped women in overcrowded, poorly heated homes where they continued textile production and household management while dealing with increased illness, food shortages, and family tensions that erupted during forced cohabitation. Pregnancy timing was often determined by seasonal factors rather than women's health or preferences,
with conception occurring during periods when additional children would be most economically burdensome for families already struggling with survival. Food allocation during shortages prioritized men and boys over women and girls, with women eating last and least during periods of scarcity while continuing to perform labor-intensive tasks that required adequate nutrition. Clothing production followed seasonal demands that required women to complete textile work during specific periods, creating additional labor requirements that were added to rather than replacing other seasonal responsibilities. Illness patterns varied seasonally, with women facing different health threats during different times of year while having no seasonal relief from work responsibilities regardless of health conditions. Religious obligations followed church calendars that required additional female labor during religious seasons when women had to provide special foods, decorations, and services for religious observances. Market activities were seasonally determined, requiring women to produce and sell goods during specific periods while having no control over market conditions that determined their family's economic success. Animal husbandry followed seasonal cycles that demanded different types of female labor throughout the year, with women responsible for breeding, birthing, and caring for livestock according to natural cycles rather than their own convenience. Weather vulnerability affected women disproportionately because their outdoor work continued regardless of conditions while their indoor work increased during periods when families spent more time at home requiring additional food preparation and household management. Chapter 12: The Intergenerational Transmission of Oppression. Medieval systems of female oppression were designed to perpetuate themselves across generations through the systematic conditioning of daughters who learned to accept and transmit the same patterns of exploitation that had destroyed their mothers' lives. Mother-daughter relationships were shaped by mothers' need to prepare daughters for lives of subordination while protecting them from the worst aspects of female experience. This created psychological conflicts where mothers had to teach daughters to accept conditions that mothers knew were unjust. Educational transmission involved mothers teaching daughters domestic skills while also conditioning them to accept male authority and female inferiority as natural and inevitable. Mothers became unwilling agents in perpetuating systems that oppressed both themselves and their daughters. Survival strategies were passed from mothers to daughters, including techniques for avoiding violence, managing limited resources, and enduring suffering without complaint. These survival skills were necessary for immediate safety but also reinforced long-term oppression. Marriage preparation required mothers to train daughters for subordination while trying to equip them with skills that might provide some protection or advantage in arranged marriages. Mothers had to prepare daughters for exploitation while hoping they might experience less suffering. Religious conditioning was transmitted through mothers who taught daughters to view their oppression as divine while privately knowing that religious justifications were used to maintain male power. Women became complicit in religious systems that justified their own exploitation. Economic education involved teaching daughters to work without compensation while accepting that their labor belonged to male relatives. Mothers trained daughters for economic exploitation while having no alternatives to offer. Social conformity was enforced by mothers who understood that daughters' survival depended on community acceptance, requiring mothers to suppress daughters' individuality and independence to protect them from social punishment. Trauma transmission occurred as mothers who had been damaged by systematic oppression struggled to provide emotional nurturing for daughters while dealing with their own psychological wounds from years of abuse and exploitation. Resistant suppression involved mothers actively discouraging daughters from challenging oppressive conditions because mothers understood that resistance would lead to severe punishment without changing systematic conditions. Hope destruction was often necessary as mothers prepared daughters for realistic expectations of suffering while trying to maintain enough optimism to make life bearable for both generations. Cultural continuity was maintained through women who transmitted traditions, values, and practices that reinforced their own oppression because they had no alternative cultural frameworks to offer their daughters. Cyclical perpetuation ensured that daughters would grow up to transmit the same patterns of oppression to their own daughters, creating systems of exploitation that survived across centuries because victims became unwilling perpetrators of the same systems that had destroyed their own lives. Thanks for joining me on this comprehensive examination of why medieval life was particularly hellish for women who faced every hardship of peasant existence plus additional layers of gender-specific oppression. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this thorough exploration of double oppression, and let me know in the comments what other overlooked historical perspectives you'd like me to examine with similar honesty. Until next time, stay grateful for women's rights, reproductive freedom, and legal protections that were won through centuries of struggle against systems designed to exploit half the human population. Remember, medieval peasant women endured unimaginable suffering while being told their oppression was natural and divinely ordained, making their survival a testament to human resilience in the face of systematic injustice.